know that, as we say it from the church center perspective, across the street there's quite a flurry of events, not to mention the annual session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, as well as the Financing for Development Forum, just to mention two major events that take the interest of non-governmental organizations, and certainly those of you I know would be attending those meetings. And so on behalf of myself and the Catholic University of Lille, thank you for taking the time to be here. In my excitement with them, I even suggested that because they are a university and certainly dealing with students and young people, that Congo will accredit them to participate in the Youth Forum. The Youth Forum is supposed to meet this week. And then sometime 3 months ago, the United Nations decided to move the Youth Forum to next week. And maybe correct, because having 3 major meetings all in the same week disperses the very little resources of NGOs, and perhaps not governments, but still also governments. Think of the Central African Republic, where the ambassador also sweeps the floor. Don't put that on record, but government missions have only 3-4 people, and they cannot be attending all of these sessions happening at the same time. And so I'm glad. But you were able to make arrangements still to meet with Patricia Chavez?
Yes.
Yes, so I gave them the name of Patricia Chavez, who is the coordinator at UNDESA for the Youth Forum. So as a university, it would be interesting for the delegation to meet with the
participation of the Catholic University in as a UN consultative body, and so we want to take the opportunity to explore this question. I think it's an interesting question for us because we as the main Catholic university in France and probably Europe, I guess, and as our DNA is really strongly focused on our how can we be an engaged university? How can we have an impact on our third parties? So really, this question of a wider impact and how can we learn from the UN agenda is really a clear question for us. To make a brief description of the Lille Catholic Universities, we have been founded by Christian businessmen and the Catholic Church around 150 years ago. And since then, I think this relation with companies, with NGOs, with local entities has been a sort of key feature of the Lille Catholic University.
The future of using negative terms, the future of debt and crisis, the many multiple crises that we face today. So the importance of future studies from an academic perspective is multiplied over when you know that nation states, member governments, and the United Nations is itself engaged in futuristic projections. So we welcome very much your contribution.
Thank you very much to the inviters. I'm so happy. I'm going to give the speech to Maëlys, who makes the introduction in English of the American book. You are the very first to know about this book. We never ever made a presentation in English about this book. This book is only 6 years old in France, and the book in American on Wilhelm Grischer will be there in the next month. So you are the very first to hear about this conference.
Maybe some of you were there, not sure. Being one of association with the World Organization as NGO, but also as somebody contributing to UNITAR for 20 years. I'm a UNITAR fellow currently. And I think over the years of working with the World Organization, I keep contributing and participating in debates, talking about the future of humanity and the planet. And you listen to economists, climatologists, futurists, and environmentalists, and there are many scenarios projected for 2030, 2040, 2050, what's going to happen to the cities, what's going to happen to the coastal areas, 7.5 million people, and you have many, many scenarios. And I would say that we can really synthesize all the scenarios, that these all experts who are projecting 2 scenarios. Transition is going to happen. Either we're going to design it, or we're going to be victims of it. And we are here in the business of designing the transition. And I think the faith organizations and the scientific academic organizations have a very specific, unique role on how to design the transition. And of course, when you're talking about designing a transition, you can, some of us can be like, have some projections about the future that is not really grounded in what we are facing right now.
Which is congenial to the kind of work we do as faith-based and religious organizations. And the ethical and the moral consideration of anything under the sun that the United Nations deal with, in fact, tinker with. I use the word tinker because it's a reminder that the fragility of the planet Earth and of human relations are, the languaging using those terms are not always what you hear in hard-nosed nation-state constructs across the street. It is civil society that raises and uses language for people on the planet, and therefore your use of the language, the flourishing of life. And if I may challenge you, Michelle, add another phrase to that, the flourishing of life and of living. Because the active word living as a condition to life itself is important, because it is the provision of food and fuel. In my own interventions, I use another set of these flowery words: food and freedom, jobs and justice, land and liberation. We use that, FF, food and freedom. It's a combination of economic and social rights and civil and political. Food and freedom, jobs and justice, land and liberation, land and liberty. And for those indigenous peoples who are here with us today, the combination of land and liberation is important. It's the notion of self-determination. If there is one agenda at the United Nations that is unfinished, it is the decolonial agenda. It's agenda on decolonization. It's an agenda of self-determination. And the university, for its research, for the archival of knowledge, for the production of knowledge and reproduction of that knowledge itself, future studies, projecting the future so that people and the planet flourish as living beings and flourish with infrastructures that empower the voice and agency of we the peoples, of the peoples of the earth, of humanity.
Long love and study of the French language, including a master's equivalent degree at the Institut d'études politiques de Paris. It's called Sciences Po, that's well known in France. And I actually attend a French-speaking church in the Episcopal Church at the same time. So this is something that is deeply personal to me and certainly has been part of my formation I am American by origin. And like you, myself growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, as a child was deeply fearful of the end of the world because of la guerre froide, the Cold War. So much so that as a child, I prayed to God to let me grow up because I really thought that I was not going to become an adult. So God granted my wish, you can thank me. Just kidding. But to just, I tell that because I find, especially as we move in spaces related to climate change, that there is what we call existential dread and a fear among young people that they will not have a tomorrow, that they will not have a future. And so I found it helpful to refer back to that time in my life. And that has really shaped my entire career. It's the reason I wanted to become a diplomat as a young person, and decided and ended up in France doing my graduate level work. And my first experience with the United Nations was working as a young person at UNESCO. And that opened
was, first of all, education. We need to educate our own members. And I think that has been, it continues to be key, to see the link. Secondly, participation, to give the opportunity. And I think very much of Pope Francis's call to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. I think as religious congregations, we have great grassroots networks working with the most marginalized in different countries around the world. And it becomes a way in which, through our efforts of accreditation, we can bring something of those voices, and we can make it possible for people to participate in ways that bring to the legal and UNE's language across the road the reality of grassroots experience around the world. And thirdly is advocate. And I think advocacy, and I just share the example, I think we try to do it at different levels. I think alone it's not possible. We need to be, and we are, model of collaboration. And so we have a group of Catholic NGO congregations who form something called the Justice Coalition of Religious. And there it's a joint thing that we are together trying to advocate. That's still within the Catholic Church. But then, like Linnea and I belong to a group of Kringo and the Climate Working Group. And we know each other through King Kringo as well. So that's very important, the interfaith dimension of our work and the ecumenical aspect among other Christian groups. And I just share the example of, I had the privilege of being present at the Biodiversity Conference in Montreal. That was just one. There, the Faith Pavilion, it was so exciting to be able to have a space of gathering where, from an interfaith perspective, based on the moral and ethical, what Linnea mentioned, so much that we share with regard especially to creation, to the environment, to our work, to promote life going forward. That was a strong space, and room was made for that voice to be heard. And a statement was presented, launched, that was signed by numerous groups around the world. That's just
time flies, and one access could create so much impact, and so that's what I wanted to start with. And then just a little bit about Soka Gakkai, which has education root. It started as a group of school teachers in Japan back in 1930, kind of pre-wartime, when the government was heading toward war, and really put aside of education system. And So the small group of school teachers were really concerned about the future of the country, and started working on educational reform. And that became the tradition of our group. So even after the war, we became a full-fledged religious organization, but we kept the education as a tradition and a priority for our movement. And so at the UN, we focus on education from a human rights standpoint, the sustainable development, gender, and so forth. And I think Veronica and Linnea also mentioned some of the things that I also wanted to emphasize, which is that, as a civil society, the NGO, we try to bring voices of people from all around the world, from all across life, and as a contribution for the intergovernmental negotiations. And for that, we have to stay involved in the process. And one example I would like to mention is that in 2017, there was an important negotiation toward the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. It's called TPNW. And we stay involved and worked with like-minded governments to make sure that education is included in the treaty as a positive obligation for the signers, the government. And then that stayed in thanks to a couple of governments who agreed on our point, and so that became a positive obligation to the signers of the treaty. And so that's how the civil society organizations can really play a vital part.
Other churches that have previously done that process of repudiation, including the Episcopal Church. We repudiated the doctrine of discovery in 2009, and I think a number of others have done so as well. So I was really pleased to see this because it's difficult to try to explain to the world that the Christian Church is now repudiating the process that started the whole colonization of Africa and the Western Hemisphere and the genocide and land theft that resulted from that, without all of us in Christendom being on board with it. Well, now I feel like this is a new beginning and that we're all on board with it. So we can work together ecumenically as followers of Christ to come to a point of reckoning with regard to the doctrine of discovery. And I say reckoning and not reconciliation, although I believe in reconciliation and hope that we will come to a point of that, but we aren't there yet. We are not there yet where we can even begin to talk about reconciliation between the church and indigenous people because we haven't fully acknowledged what has been done in the past and the church's role in it. There are so many people who've never heard of the doctrine of discovery. And for those who have heard of it, they don't know what it is, really, because they haven't been taught. We haven't been talking about it in our educational systems. We haven't been talking about it in the church, really at all. So we need to do that as we come to a point of reckoning at this time. We need to acknowledge the doctrine of discovery, teach our people what it is, and what the results of it were in Africa and in the Western Hemisphere. We need to teach our people that the doctrine of discovery provided the foundation for the horrible process of colonization and genocide and enforced assimilation of indigenous people, all in the name of Christ, tragically, unfortunately, and mistakenly.
Christian nation on earth. It was also the most literate nation on earth because the Calvinists who came also insisted that people learn to read. And the kings and queens and the chiefs all decided that would be very important for their people to learn how to read. So the Hawaiian language was reduced to an alphabet, and people learned to read their own language, and the Bible was translated into Hawaiian. So literally every household, almost to a person, could read the Bible, and actually had read the Bible. And so it became a very profoundly Christian nation. And in 1839, the king, in 1825, he decided to actually call his nation a Christian nation and dedicated his nation to the Lord. In 1839, he issued a declaration of rights, a declaration of rights for Hawaiians. And in it, it's kind of similar to the Declaration of Independence, except it was quite Hawaiian in its concept or in its philosophical content. For instance, he used, instead of all men are created equal, he used the phrase, all men are made of one blood. And so the difference here was that the Hawaiians regarded everyone as related. And he said, my relations, we're related. We're not just responsible legally to be at a legal status with one another, but we're related, and therefore we're family, and therefore we must treat each other as such. So that's how profound the gospel had an effect on the Declaration of Rights. And likewise, when the first Constitution was instituted in 1840, the first paragraph of it said, all laws of the Hawaiian Kingdom shall conform to the laws of Jehovah God.